2 weeks before retirement, I walked into HR, expecting to sign a few documents, shake a few hands, and leave quietly just the way I'd planned it. But the woman behind the desk squinted at her screen like she was seeing my name for the first time. She clicked through a few tabs, then looked up with a smile that didn't match the confusion in her eyes. "We're not seeing your file," she said, almost too casually. "It might have been lost during the last system migration. My pension records, my service timeline, for decades of employment vanished." Just like that, she called it a clerical error. Said it happens sometimes. Suggested I check my personal email for confirmation. There was none. That's when I stopped listening and started paying attention. It wasn't the missing data that got MIT was the tone, the softness in her voice, the way she avoided eye contact after saying unfortunately. No, this wasn't a glitch, it was a setup, and whoever planned it thought I wouldn't notice, or wouldn't fight back. My name's Michael Carpenter. I'm 64 years old, and until 2 weeks ago, I was the payroll manager at Holden and Bright. I spent 28 years in that role, longer than most people stick with a marriage. Before that, I worked in the shipping department. Fresh out of my 20s and eager to keep my head down and my record clean, I wasn't ambitious in the way people usually mean it. I didn't angle for titles or office politics. I didn't play golf with the partners. But if someone needed a problem fixed at midnight, or a discrepancy traced back to a decimal point from 1997, they called me. I knew the systems better than anyone. Built some of them, actually. I was the guy you could count on to do the work, quietly, with no fuss and no need for applause. It wasn't about being invisible, it was about being solid, predictable, useful. Most people in the office liked me. Some didn't really know me. That was fine. I wasn't there to be liked. I came in early, stayed late when needed, and left everything at the desk when I walked out. My badge never missed a scan. My reports never missed a deadline. At home, it was a different story. My wife Emily held everything together while I buried myself in spreadsheets and audits. She never complained. Not once. We made a deal early. She'd take care of our world, and I'd take care of our future. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. The plan was simple. I'd finish my final 2 weeks, collect what I'd earned, and we'd take that rail tour across Europe she'd been dreaming about since we were first married. First-class tickets, no corners cut. She waited a long time for that trip, and I was supposed to be the man who made it happen. It started with a mild explanation, something about a system migration last year, and a few legacy records not transferring properly. Dana, the head of HR, said it like she was talking about a missing lunch order. No urgency, no concern, just an apology and a suggestion. If you happen to have your own records, that might help us speed things up. I almost laughed. 40 years in the company, and now they wanted me to verify it. Then she mentioned 2006. She said that's when my employment record seemed to begin, as if I hadn't already logged over 2 decades by then. I stopped smiling. It was 1984, I said, keeping my voice even. Her eyes didn't waver, but the pause that followed said everything. "That's not what's in the system," she repeated, a bit softer this time. I asked to see the pension breakdown. She offered to check and call me back. That call never came. The following week I returned for answers. This time, Dana didn't smile. She said they had reviewed everything and couldn't verify continuous employment prior to 2006. No formal record of hire, no HR logs, no payroll entries. As far as the system was concerned, my first 22 years simply didn't exist. I asked who made that call, who decided that an entire career could be deleted by a line of code. She didn't answer direct, said, "Sometimes records get archived and can't be recovered." It wasn't just her words. It was the tone, flat, rehearsed, indifferent. The kind of tone people use when they've already moved on from the damage they're doing. I'd heard it before, in layoff meetings, in quiet firings, in the way HR distanced themselves from the decisions they enforced, and suddenly it clicked. This wasn't a one-off issue. It was a process. One they'd likely used on others just quietly enough to avoid lawsuits or headlines. People approaching retirement age who wouldn't push back. People who couldn't prove what the system refused to remember. I spent my whole career making sure those systems worked. Payroll audits, compliance reviews. I cleaned up more errors than I can count, some of them big enough to sink a quarter's earnings. And yet here I was, being told I didn't exist, that the work never happened, that my retirement wasn't verifiable. The worst part wasn't the loss, it was the way it was delivered. Clinical, efficient, like they were discussing a billing discrepancy, not a man's entire life. In that moment, something shifted. Not just the fear of losing the pension or the financial strain it would bring. It was deeper than that. Something foundational, like a crack forming in the trust I'd held for 40 years. I had always believed that if you kept your head down, did the work, stayed loyal, the system would take care of you in the end. But now I was starting to understand something I'd ignored for too long. The system wasn't broken. It was built this way. I didn't slam the door or demand a meeting with upper management. There was no dramatic exit, no raised voice echoing through the building, just a quiet walk back to my car, keys in hand, engine off, and 22 minutes of stillness. I stared at the dashboard like it might offer some kind of explanation. The people inside couldn't. My phone buzzed Emily. I let it ring. I wasn't ready to tell her what had happened, not because I couldn't handle it, but because I needed to think clearly before emotion got in the way. Panic would have been easy, so would anger. But neither had ever helped anyone win in a system designed to outlast emotion. I'd spent years watching others self-destruct when things turned unfair. I'd seen good people yell, threaten, walk out on principle and lose, not because they were wrong, but because they reacted too fast. What they didn't understand was that silence isn't weakness. It's a tactic, and if there was one thing I'd learned over 4 decades in payroll and internal audits, it was that most people don't know what they've missed until someone points it out in writing. With evidence that so I sat there quietly pulling pieces together in my head. People I'd worked with, managers who had signed my reviews, internal memos I'd archived, spreadsheets from before digital records were standard. They'd scrubbed my file from the system, but they couldn't scrub my memory, and they had no idea what I'd kept. That's when the fog started to lift. The fear didn't disappear, but it lost its grip. Because for the first time since that HR meeting, I remembered something important. I never trusted the system, not fully. That's why I still had originals, signed, dated, stamped, sitting in labeled boxers in the basement, marked, just in case. I'd spent a lifetime quietly fixing other people's mistakes, but this time, I wasn't going to fix theirs. I didn't waste time trying to convince anyone. I already knew what their response would become: deflection, polite deed ends, so I went to work the only way I knew how, methodically. Over the next 3 days, the dining room became my audit floor. I pulled out plastic bins from the basement, ones I hadn't touched in over a decade. Emily didn't ask questions. She just brought coffee, set it down without a word, and let me work. We'd been married long enough for her to know when I was past small talk. Each box had labels: 8489 payroll, reviews, 90s, ISK HR docs. I'd kept them for no reason I could ever justify, just something about letting go of paper never sat right with me. Now, that instinct felt less paranoid and more prescient. It started with the offer letter, dated July 9, 1984, signed by Ronald Beecham, who'd died in '99. That signature alone was something they couldn't replicate or deny. Then came the performance reviews, handwritten notes and margins, dated annually through the late '80s and early '90s. Terms like reliable under pressure, sharp eye for compliance, indispensable, written in different pens, by a rotating cast of supervisors. All of it signed, all of it real. Promotion memos, followed copies of formal announcements from HR, dated and initialed. Then I found the thick folder marked protocols. It contained documentation I'd created in 1991 when we overhauled the payroll process, drafts, flowcharts, final implementation memos. Most were stamped internal use only. I remembered each meeting that led to those forms, remembered who pushed back, who approved, who ignored the details. Their initials were all there. It was more than just proof of employment, it was proof of responsibility. I hadn't just worked there, I had helped build the infrastructure they now use to erase me. And then came the sensitive stuff. Not illegal, not scandalous, but revealing. Emails I'd printed and stored from a decade ago. When an executive wanted to adjust performance targets retroactively to inflate his team's bonuses, he called in alignment. I flagged it quietly, documented the change, and moved on. But the paper trail remained. That kind of material doesn't disappear easily, especially not when you're the one who filed it. By the end of the second day, I had a full timeline of 4's promotions, reviews, contributions, and internal fixes that never made it into public reports. Every piece filled another gap in the record HR had tried to deny existed. But it was the third day that brought the final piece. Marcia, she'd retired the year before, spent over 30 years in admin and quietly tracked more than most people. Realized, I reached out and asked if she had a moment to talk. She met me at a cafe near her neighborhood. Same clipped tone, same no-nonsense manner she'd had back when we worked together. When I told her what happened, she didn't look surprised, just sighed. "You're not the only one," she said. "They've been doing it quietly, targeting employees close to retirement. Erase a few years, adjust some files, and they cut their liability by 6 figures. Most people don't even realize it until they're gone." I asked why no one said anything, because most don't catch it in time, and the ones who do, they just want out. Her words settled in. This wasn't carelessness. It wasn't even malice in the traditional sense. It was strategy. Cold cost-saving efficiency dressed up as administrative error. Someone high up decided I was too expensive to retire. That shaving 2 decades off my record was a clean way to clear a line item. On a budget report, they didn't expect I'd kept anything, but I had everything. And for the first time, I wasn't just angry, I was certain. This wasn't an error, it was policy, and I had the receipts. There was never a moment where I fantasized about taking them down. No thoughts of press leaks or courtroom showdowns. That's not who I am. I didn't want a spectacle. I wanted my retirement and the respect that was supposed to come with it, so I did what I've always done. I got organized. Every key document I'd gathered went into a black folder, labeled cleanly Holden and Bright MC. Inside, I arranged everything chronologically: offer, letters, reviews, promotions, emails, policy drafts. I created an index and flagged key pages with sticky tabs. By the time I zipped it shut, it looked more like an audit package than a grievance. I scanned everything into PDFs and organized the files on a flash drive. Then I reached out to a labor attorney, not one of those billboard types with slogans and promises. Just a quiet professional referred to me by an old contact. His office was small, neat, and the man behind the desk didn't blink once as I walked him through the materials. When I finished, he leaned back, glanced at the folder, and said, "You're not asking for anything. You're reminding them what they already owe you." That line stayed with me. It wasn't about demanding compensation or forcing a hand. It was about stating calmly and clearly that I knew the value of my work hand, that I still had the proof, all of it. We drafted a letter together. It was short, 2 paragraphs at most. Addressed to HR, copied to the Chief Operating Officer. No dramatic accusations, no emotional appeals. Just a concise summary of the records I held, including specific inconsistencies between their current system and the physical documents. I attached a timeline, a scanned appendix of all relevant records, and one closing line. I expected written resolution within 5 business days, that we included no threats, no ultimatums, but I made sure the attachments were unmistakably clear about the legal implications: loss of benefits, age-based discrimination, negligent misrepresentation, words that don't scream, they whisper, but they carry weight in the right rooms. I double-checked every date, every name, every signature. If they tried to dispute a single detail, I wanted to be ready. After the letter was sent, I didn't refresh my email. I didn't pace the living room. I went about my days, like I always had, quiet, deliberate, composed. Emily noticed the shift. She asked if things were moving in the right direction. "They'll respond," I told her. "They just need a moment to realize who they're dealing with." And I meant that not as a threat, but as a certainty. I wasn't the guy they could erase with a system update. I was the guy who built half of what they still used. It wasn't about power. It was about truth. And truth, when it's documented well enough, doesn't have to shout. 3 days after the letter was sent, I got an email from Dana. The subject line read, "Follow-up meeting request." The body was polite, vague language about clarifying documentation and closing the loop before your transition. No mention of the folder, no mention of the timeline I'd given them. But the tone had shifted. The wording was careful, overly formal, meant to sound neutral, but padded with discomfort. They scheduled me for 10:30 a.m. Thursday. Conference room B-1. We used to conduct payroll audits during internal reviews. I knew the acoustics, the lighting, even the slight delay in the projector's startup. Funny how many details stay with you when you've spent a lifetime in the background. When I arrived, Dana was already seated, flanked by 2 others. To her right sat Tom Delaney, the VP of Operations. We'd crossed paths over the years, pleasant enough, but always just out of reach, like someone trying to avoid forming memories with people below his pay grade. The third man, introduced as legal counsel, didn't offer a name, just a firm handshake and a steady stare. They offered me coffee. I declined. Dana started with a breath and an apology. She spoke of system irregularities and the challenges of data migration. She used phrases like administrative gap and archival inconsistencies. Her voice was smooth, but she never made eye contact for more than a few seconds. I didn't interrupt. I wanted to hear every word. When she finished, I reached down, pulled the folder from my bag, and slid it across the table. No grand gesture, no commentary, just the weight of 40 years contained in labeled tabs and numbered pages. "This is my file," I said. "Everything you claimed didn't exist." They didn't touch it at first. Tom gave Dana a look, then opened the cover. The legal counsel leaned in, reading upside down. Page by page, the atmosphere changed. First confusion, then recognition, then something close to concern. The moment that caught them off guard was the memo from 1991, my documentation of the original payroll overhaul, complete with staff signatures and my handwritten notes. It was internal only, and I was sure none of them had seen it before. The attorney flipped back and forth between pages, quietly confirming the timeline. Nobody said much for several minutes. Dana finally spoke again. Her tone was different, this timeless, polished, more careful. "It's clear we need to update our internal records," she said, as if that was all this was. A clerical oversight, a missed upload. Tom added something about how much they valued my contribution and how unfortunate it was that a dedicated employee had experienced such confusion. He said the word confusion twice, like saying it enough might replace accountability. Then came the offer: full pension reinstated, retroactive pay adjustment, immediate documentation processing. It was quick, delivered like a pre-approved loan, almost routine. I didn't smile, didn't nod. I just said what I came to say. "I won't be signing anything today. My attorney will review the offer and respond." Tom's jaw tightened slightly, but he covered it well. Dana offered a thin smile and said she understood. The legal counsel simply gave a quiet nod, already anticipating the negotiation. As I stood to leave, Tom made a final comment: "You're very organized. It wasn't a compliment. It was a realization. I met his eyes. It was my job. Outside the conference room, the air felt lighter. Not victorious, just finished. What struck me most was how none of them argued. No denials, no counterclaims. They knew what they'd done, and more importantly, they knew I could prove it. I walked out the same way I came, in quiet, steady, calm. But this time, they watched me leave. It's been 5 months since I walked out of that building for the last time. Retirement came on. Schedule no delays, no apologies, just the final deposit and a formal letter that barely acknowledged the ordeal. I didn't need fanfare, I needed closure. And in its own quiet way, I got it. Europe was everything Emily had imagined. We took the long route, no rushing between cities, no fixed itinerary, just time, finally ours. We never brought up the company, there was no need. The silence between us wasn't avoidance, it was healing. She knew what I had carried, and I knew what she had waited for. That was enough. My pension arrives like clockwork now. The numbers match, the math holds. I still check every line not because I expect another trick, but because habits like that don't just stop. A lifetime of precision doesn't retire with you. From what I hear, Dana's no longer there. No formal announcement, no dramatic fallout. Just a quiet replacement and a vague internal memo about restructuring. It fits. The people who implement things like this rarely face a spotlight. They just disappear into the next version of the system. But I didn't need her to fall. That was never the point. I didn't fight because I was angry. I fought because I couldn't accept being erased. People like me, we don't show up in the company yearbooks or the marketing videos. We're not the ones giving keynote speeches or getting press coverage. But we keep the place running. We hold the invisible threads, and when those threads are cut, the whole thing, frays. I kept the folder, not to gloat, not as leverage, but because it mattered. It reminded me that 40 years of work can still have weight, even when someone tries to pretend otherwise. It's tucked away, now filed, backed up, labeled, not out of bitterness, but out of principle. If you've ever been told to just let it go, to not make waves, to move on, think twice. Some things are worth letting go. But some are worth documenting, defending, preserving especially, when the world would rather you quietly vanish, because the truth is, loyalty doesn't mean silence. And respect isn't something you ask for at the end. It's something you protect all the way through. Some records may get lost in the system, but the ones that matter, those outlast it. And if you're watching this wondering whether to speak up or stay quiet, let this be your answer.